Museums Victoria respectfully acknowledges the traditional owners of the lands where we work, the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and First Peoples language groups and communities across Victoria and Australia. We pay our respects to their elders past, present, and their emerging leaders. Our organisation, in partnership with the First Peoples of Victoria, is working to place First Peoples' living cultures and histories at the core of our practice.
Hey, good evening everybody, welcome. It's wonderful, I can hear your excited murmurings as you're getting comfortable in your seats. Please fasten your seatbelts because this is going to be a pretty amazing night. My name's Narine Weiss. I'm the Director of Museums Victoria Research Institute. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here tonight for this very special event with our fantastic distinguished guest speaker, Professor Anil Seth. A warm welcome to those of us also who are joining us online. And before we start, let's really, take a moment to acknowledge that we are on Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung peoples, the lands of the Eastern Kulin Nation. We acknowledge those peoples, the magnificent lands that we are on, and the wisdom that comes through those lands and the peoples. They are the traditional owners of this land, and we gather here this evening and should acknowledge and always remember that. I'd like to pay my respects to ancestors, to all elders, and any First Nations people who are with us this evening. Hello. So the program tonight, The New Science of Consciousness, it's of course presented in partnership with the University of Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences. And I don't think there is any bigger realm out there. The greatest frontier, we think it's space, I'd say consciousness, how we make sense of the universe, how we make sense of being a human and how we perceive that universe around us. And this exciting talk will really dig deep into the science behind it, knowing that as humans who've been around for hundreds of thousands of years, it is something we've always been trying to make sense of. And you saw a little bit of a promo reel here, and that essentially is saying to you that for 165 years, Museums Victoria has been doing research and has a collection, and we've used our research and collections to inspire inquiry, creating new knowledge that shapes our understanding very much of our place here in southeastern Australia, but our understanding of ourselves, our societies, our past, present and future. It's my great pleasure now to introduce you to a very well-known person, our host tonight, ABC Radio National's very famous Natasha Mitchell. Please make her welcome.
That's Anil. Thank you, Narine. I think we're about to see the very famous person speak on this stage. It's fantastic to be on Kulin country here at the Melbourne Museum in Naarm. 60,000 years of science in this place. There's a knowledge base. Big welcome to our online viewers. It's so great to have you joining us, great to have you in the room with us, and we really want to involve you in the conversation tonight. So you just go to slido.com. The information will be on the wall a bit later, but slido.com, you can do it right now, and you use the password, event code, Seth, that's capital S, Seth 1810, Seth 1810. So we'd love your questions and I'd love to weave them in throughout. But this really is one of the most delicious and puzzling and incredible puzzles of our lives, isn't it? This internal experience of consciousness, your rich inner life. It's confounded scientists and philosophers for centuries. The Australian philosopher David Chalmers has called it the hard problem of consciousness. What causes it? What makes our mind actually happen? How is it that we have a sense of the self, this distinct self called Tash and whoever you are, and how do our neurons create that? And does the feeling of red feel the same to me as it does to you? So many things to think about. What happens when we go under an anaesthetic? Will we ever have a conscious AI, and what would that mean for ourselves? So all sorts of great questions to explore tonight, and we have one of the world's most foremost researchers trying to understand how our biology creates consciousness. I want to let you know that we're also recording tonight for Big Ideas, the program I host at the ABC and on the ABC Listen app, and so keep that in mind. You'll be able to catch up with the program on the ABC Listen app. So we're going to have a great presentation from our special guest, and then Olivia Carter from the University of Melbourne would join us on the stage for conversation. Anil Seth is the star of the night. He is Professor of Cognitive and Computational Neuroscience. He's Director of the Sussex Centre for Consciousness Science at the University of Sussex. He's also co-director of a fantastic sounding initiative, the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, on the program on brain, mind and consciousness. That's right, isn't it? And his research brings together neuroscience and maths and computer science and psychology and philosophy and psychiatry. He gets to have all the fun, and his latest book is a bestseller. We will be selling it tonight. He will be signing copies for you after the event, and it's called Being You, A New Science of Consciousness. Please welcome to the stage here in Melbourne, Anil Seth.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I was in Melbourne, I think, about 30 years ago was the last time. And so it's wonderful to be back and to be able to be here for a few years. So a few years, a few weeks. I don't know. See if I'm still here in a few years. Something will have gone wrong. Maybe we can start the slides, and then I will get going. And actually, the way I'm going to get going is Natasha mentioned this phenomenon of anesthesia. And I'm just interested how many people, while we're waiting, how many people have gone through general anesthesia, are willing to admit it? A lot of you. Okay, that's a lot. That's very impressive. And thinking back to my own experience of anesthesia, most recent one was about a few years ago now. And it was really striking for me that it wasn't like sleep. You know, when you have general anesthesia, you are completely gone. And then you are back. And it seems like no time has passed at all. It could have been 5 minutes, it could have been 5 hours, it could have been 50 years. You are gone and then you are back. It's a kind of oblivion that is a kind of premonition of the not being there that would have accompanied you before you were born and maybe you after you die. And the intriguing thing about general anesthesia is that it's just a simple chemical intervention in the brain, and consciousness is completely abolished. I think there's one thing that reveals the intimate dependency of conscious experience, the what it is likeness to be you or be me. It's this phenomenon of anesthesia. And in that phenomenon, and in that question, I think lies what's been one of the biggest challenges in all of science and philosophy for hundreds, thousands of years, which is how is it that mere stuff, admittedly very complicated stuff inside each of your heads, mere stuff all the same, electrified pate, gives rise to conscious experiences, the experiences of a world around you and of being a self within it. Now, the sort of almost implausibility of coming up with any kind of explanation about this has motivated what Natasha introduced earlier as the hard problem of consciousness. This is David Chalmers, a friend and colleague, a philosopher, who's very famous for coining this term, the hard problem. And he puts it like this. He says that, why should physical processing give rise to a rich inner life at all? It seems objectively unreasonable that it should, and yet it does. That's the hard problem. And in the face of the apparent intractable mystery posed by the hard problem, it's tempting to reach for sort of radical solutions, like consciousness is everywhere, it's fundamental and ubiquitous, built into the very structure of the universe at the most fundamental level. Or some philosophers might even try and persuade you that we're just mistaken, there's no real problem here at all. Consciousness doesn't really exist. Now, my approach, which I'll just give you a hint about this evening, is a little different. It's actually quite similar to what of my fellow neuroscientists do, and I've called it, tried a little dig at David Chalmers, the real problem of consciousness, not the hard problem. And the real problem of consciousness is basically accepts that we have conscious experiences, but instead of treating it as one big scary mystery that's going to be resolved in a flash of eureka insight, that consciousness has many different properties, which can manifest in different ways for different people and different species. And if we can, bit by bit, account for these different properties that consciousness has, then this sense of mystery will gradually start to dissolve and eventually, I hope, disappear in a puff of metaphysical smoke. So what are these properties of consciousness? Well, there's many ways you can think about this. The way I like to think about it is to divide consciousness, very broadly speaking, into level, how conscious you are at any given time, the difference between general anesthesia and being awake and alert and aware. Conscious content, when you are conscious, you're conscious of something, the sights and sounds and smells and people and objects and places that populate our conscious experiences at any one time. And then I think, for most of us, most importantly of all, conscious self, the experience of being you or of being me, what it is that can explain our specific experience of being a conscious individual. Now, today I'm not going to talk about level, though it might come up in the discussion, but I want to give you a sense of how, at least I think, about conscious content and conscious self. And let's start from the beginning. On Sunday, I was lucky enough with a friend and a colleague to take a drive down the Great Ocean Road. I didn't quite realize how far it was going to be. It was a day trip. It turned out to be 500 kilometers in 12 and a half hours. But, Australia is big, as I'm learning. And on this drive, I remember looking out this beautiful beach, and it just seems as though the world just pours itself into the mind through the transparent windows of the eyes and the ears and all the other senses. Just there it is. And the self might seem to be the thing, the essence of me that does the perceiving, that is receiving all this information and figuring out what to do next. That's kind of how it seems. Like there's a world out there. We perceive that world out there through the information coming from our senses. The self is the thing that does the perceiving, and then the self decides what to do next. Have a cup of coffee, go drive some more, whatever, and then change the world, and on we go around. Sense, think, and act. That's how things seem. But how things seem in science and philosophy and in life probably is a very poor guide to how they actually are. And instead of the self being that which does the perceiving, I think a more useful, more enlightening, and ultimately more satisfying way of thinking about this is the self is itself a kind of perception too. In fact, both the world and the self are what I like to call kinds of controlled hallucinations, brain-based best guesses about the causes of what's going on out there in the world or in here in the body. And that's what constitutes our conscious experience. So let's start very simple. Let's start with color. Now, color is a very, very familiar aspect of our visual world. It's very important to us. But we've known for centuries that color doesn't exist out there in the world independent of our minds and our brains. There is just electromagnetic radiation at varying wavelengths. And the cells in our eyes are sensitive to only just a very thin slice of reality. This thin slice of reality, color-wise, that's where we live. But out of those three, for most of us, three different wavelengths of light, which are not themselves colored, our brains conjure up a beautiful universe of color. And in this sense, what we experience is both less than what's there, it's just a thin slice of reality, but more than what's there, because not just three wavelengths, we experience millions of colors. Our relationship with reality is indirect in this way, but it's creatively indirect, I think. And the idea that explains this, and that I think explains all of our experiences, is that your brain is a prediction machine, and that what you hear, what you see, what you feel, what you touch, what you smell, are the result of the brain's predictions about what's going on in the world and in the body. Not a new idea at all. Plato, thousands of years ago, with his allegory of the cave, told the story of prisoners trapped in this cave. All they had access to was shadows cast on the wall. And they took the shadows to be real, because that was their world. They didn't have access to the real world outside. And if we zoom to the present day, cut out 2,000 years of intervening thought, instead of prisoners in a cave, think about your brain trapped inside the bony vault of the skull. also has no direct access to what's out there in the world. All the brain has to go on are electrical signals, which are only indirectly related to things in the world, whatever they may be. And these signals, they don't come with labels on, like I'm from a cup of coffee, or I'm from a car, or even I'm from a foot. They are just electrical signals. To make sense of them, the brain has to interpret them, so the idea goes, in terms of its prior expectations or beliefs that you may not know that your brain has about what's going on. And it's this combination of the brain's prior knowledge about what's happening with these sensory signals that, I think, gives us what we experience. So the brain doesn't hear light. The brain never hears light. The brain doesn't hear sound or see light. What we experience is the brain's best guess of the causes of the sensory signals that it receives. Now, there are many examples of this. I can give you a couple of them now. And here's one example, which is a beautiful phenomenon. It's called the hollow mask example. If you take a mask and you rotate it, what tends to happen is there's a point when you rotate the mask, and you can try this if you've got a mask at home. There's a midpoint at which it seems to rotate in two directions at once. People seeing that? Yeah, and I think so every face that you've ever seen, that your ancestors have ever seen, going back hundreds, thousands, millennia, has always pointed outwards, apart from now, or maybe a couple of other times. So your brain has a very strong prior belief that faces point outwards, and it would rather see a face going in two directions at once than seeing an inward pointing face. So our brain's expectations here shape our experience in a very, very fundamental way. One more example, using sound. So I want you to listen to this sound, and if you've heard me do this before, please, just keep it quiet for me, don't say anything. But anyway, listen to this sound and have a think about what's going on. Any idea? Okay, I'll play it one more time. Okay, now I'm going to play another sound. Have a listen.
I think Brexit is a really terrible idea.
So I recorded this some years ago, but I have not changed my mind. Now listen to the first sound I played. I'm going to play you exactly the same sound that I played at first. Just in case you didn't get it. Now, what's amazing to me here is that the sensory information coming into your brain hasn't changed at all. All that's changed is your brain's expectations about the causes of those sounds. And suddenly those sounds not only carry meaning, you're experiencing them differently. You hear a different thing. So our brain's expectations can shape what we experience in a way that can change very rapidly. Now, all of these examples, I think, have been known for a while, but they really change fundamentally how we think about how brains do what they do. This is a picture of the visual system of a brain. And these are the kinds of pictures that I used to see when I was reading textbooks 30 years ago when I was starting out. And in the classic idea of how the brain works, how visual systems work in this case, it's that information comes from the world and it progresses into the brain in a kind of outside-in, bottom-up direction, with features of increasing complexity being fished out of this stream of information the further it gets into the brain. That's the sort of classical idea of how perception works. It's analyzing this information that's streaming into the brain from the world. Now, in the view that I've been suggesting to you, it's in fact completely the opposite way around. Instead of the brain reading out the world through the sensory signals, the brain is continually generating predictions about what's out there or about the activity of other neurons, and using the sensory signals just simply to keep the brain calibrated to the world in useful ways. Sensory signals now just constitute prediction errors, the difference between what the brain expects and what it gets at every level of processing. Now, the implication of this, I think, is quite profound. It means that what we experience is always actively generated. It comes from the inside out or the top down and is controlled by, reined in by, sensory signals coming from the world. So while we're used to saying things like, I'll believe it when I see it, it's probably more accurate to say that I will see it when I believe it or when my brain believes it. Then you will see it. If your brain believes something is going on, you will see it. And we've all experienced versions of this that sort of make this clear. We can see faces in clouds, right? And we can see faces even in the arrangement of windows on a building. We see faces everywhere, again, because faces are super important to us. Now, a few years ago, kind of playing around, because this is how experiments usually start, with my postdoc at the time, Keisuke Suzuki, we took this phenomenon and we used a sort of approach based on machine learning, where we took a panoramic video of Sussex campus and we transformed it so that it was as if the brain had a strong prior prediction that dogs was the answer. And if you do that, you get a very weird transformation of Sussex University campus with rather too many dogs than is normal on a Tuesday afternoon. And the point about doing this is that it's fun, but it's also a way of illustrating that we can use, in this case, computational modeling to model not what somebody does or how they behave, but what they experience. And this is actually an approach that we've been taking on more recently, and what we're doing right now is using this approach to try to model specific kinds of visual hallucinations, hallucinations that people might have in Parkinson's disease, under psychedelics, after losing their vision in something called Charles-Bonnet syndrome. And in each case, we can begin to understand what the mechanisms are that lead people to experience the world in these different ways, and therefore get a better handle on what it's like for us to experience the world in the way we do all the time. So the take-home idea here is really that hallucination you can think of as a kind of uncontrolled perception where the brain's predictions lose their grip on reality. But the flip side of that is that perception in the here and now, in normal life, is also a kind of hallucination. But not an arbitrary one, not one that's made up. It's a controlled hallucination that is geared to the world in ways determined not by accuracy, but by how useful it is for the organism in the business of surviving. And the same goes also for the self. The self is not the thing that does the perceiving. The self is a kind of perception too. And one way to illustrate this is to think, what does it mean to experience being a self? You know, what kinds of experiences are there? And there are many different ways in which we experience selfhood. There's the experience of being associated with this object called my body. You know, I experience it as an object in the world. This is my body, that isn't. I have emotions and moods. But I also experience the world from a first-person point of view, looking out. I have experiences of volition, agency, what people call free will. And then I have experiences of being a continuous person over time, Anil Seth, that's partly constituted also by the social networks in which I live. All of these aspects of self can come apart in psychiatry and neurology clinics and also in the lab. And they, I think, show that what it is to be any self is not a single thing. It's a constellation of properties that come together in a particular way for us humans and for each of us individually. Just to illustrate one particular example of this, there's the easiest part of this to illustrate is the experience of what object is the body. And this is something that it's easy to take for granted, but perhaps we shouldn't take it for granted. It might be something that the brain is actively constructing all the time. This is an illusion. There's an illusion called the rubber hand illusion. How many people have heard of the rubber hand illusion? Oh, most people. That's really good. Probably too many people from the university here. I don't know. In the rubber hand illusion, for those of you who don't know, what happens is there's a participant, and in front of him is a rubber hand, a fake hand, and his real hand is hidden from sight. And the fake hand is put in a place which is plausibly where a real hand might be, and it kind of looks like a hand, apart from not being connected to his body, but forget about that bit. And then the experimenter takes two paintbrushes and strokes both the fake rubber hand and the guy's real hand in synchrony. So from the perspective of the person's brain, it's sort of, well, I can see a hand and I can see it being touched and I can feel touch, so, you know, whatever. Maybe it's my hand. And for a lot of people, there is this kind of uncanny experience that the fake hand starts to feel a little bit like part of their body. There are various ways to test it. A very good way to test it is to stab it and see what happens to the person. If the illusion is working, it's rather easy to tell. So this shows, I think, quite nicely that our experience of what is the body can change. I can't help mentioning that there's a standard story about this in terms of the brain putting together information from different sources, touch, sight, and so on. One of my colleagues at Sussex University, Peter Lush, has spent a long time trying to show actually what's going on for most people is probably, it's just how hypnotically suggestible you are because you're in this situation. It's a very strong encouragement to experience things a particular way, and some people really do that. But either way, it shows that our experience of what the body is can change. Peter did the rubber hand illusion on 353 people at Sussex the other year, which was quite a heroic experiment. So there are experiences of having a body. There are also experiences of just being a body, the emotions, the moods that guide our lives, and the basic, hard to describe sense of simply being a living organism that I think is at the heart, the base of being a self. And how does this come about? Well, just as the brain is isolated from the rest of the world, it's also shut off in many ways from the rest of the body. It doesn't have direct access to what's going on in the body. It has to perceive it. So it has to, again, rely on sensory signals and interpret them. There's a whole domain of perception called interoception, which is about perception of the physiological condition of the body based on sensory signals coming from the heart, the liver, the gut, the blood vessels, all of these kinds of things. And the same idea applies, at least I think so, that the brain doesn't just simply read out these signals, it's always making predictions about the causes of signals from within the body. And what we experience as emotion in this case is the content of the brain's predictions about how good a job the brain is doing at keeping the body alive, keeping the physiology where it ought to be. And I think there's a really interesting clue here about how this general idea of the predictive brain can explain many different aspects of how we experience the world and the self. Like when the brain is making predictions about objects out there in the world, the predictions have to be about where things are and how they're moving. And so that's what we experience. We experience things in spatial arrangements with respect to each other and they're moving. But when the brain is making predictions about the interior of the body, it doesn't care where things are. It doesn't care what color the liver is, or what shape it is. It cares how good a job it's doing at keeping us alive. In a sense, that's what brains are really for. Ultimately, the brain is for keeping the body alive. Everything else is extra. And so if you think about it from that perspective, then the mechanisms that give us conscious experiences become intimately related to our nature as living creatures. The brain evolved, developed, and operates always in light of this fundamental biological imperative to keep the body alive. And so every kind of prediction that the brain makes ultimately has this relevance in keeping us physiologically going. And this brings consciousness much more close to our nature as living creatures, rather than this abstract program that running on the mindware of the brain's wetware. Consciousness in this view is a deeply biological, deeply embedded phenomenon that I think brings us much closer to the rest of nature. So as I like to say, we perceive the world around us and ourselves within it with, through, and because of our living bodies. We're more than just cognitive computers encased by meat machines. So I want to finish and make sure we've got plenty of time for discussion with just a couple of implications of all this. One, I've already hinted at, that if these ideas are on the right track and consciousness is very, very closely related to our nature as living creatures, then the possibility of conscious artificial intelligence becomes, I think, reassuringly remote. Before we have conscious AI, we'd need living machines, and that's not the trajectory that AI is going on right now. Just making something smarter doesn't make it conscious. A second implication is that we all have different brains. So just as we differ on the outside, we're all going to differ on the inside too. The novelist Anil Seth put it beautifully. We do not see things as they are. We see them as we are, and we are, of course, all different within communities, but across time and across cultures too. There will be large differences that won't be apparent because we can't have direct access to each other's experiences. We'll underestimate the rich diversity that might characterize our inner lives. I'm underlining this because there's a project you can join in with and help with a bit. But with my research group, we have a project called the Perception Census, which is trying, I think, it's a uniquely ambitious, large-scale experiment to try and characterize these differences, to map out how much we vary in the uniqueness of our experiences of the world and of the self. This is called the perception census, and it's a collection of about 50 different illusions and little experiments of the sort that I've been showing you. And you can do it from home on your own computer. And we've had so far already more than 30,000 people take part from over 100 countries aged 18 to 80 to give us, I think, a uniquely broad picture of this rich diversity that I think is essential to actually human flourishing in many ways. So do give it a go if you can. It's closing at the end of October, so it's a last push for participation. And really I want to leave it there, because there's lots more to talk about in the discussion. There is, of course, a book. But yes, consciousness, I really think, is not only this deep philosophical and scientific mystery, it's grabbed me because it's also a personal mystery. And by trying to understand consciousness, we're really trying to understand who we are in the world. And I think that's a mystery that we each try to face in our own ways. Thank you very much.
Anil Seth. Anil Seth, are we on? Yes. Come on down, sir. Thank you so much. Let's give it up for Anil again. And look, joining us on the stage, I'm delighted to introduce Olivia Carter, who's a local professor in psychology at the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences at the University of Melbourne, who are co-hosting tonight's event. Olivia's research investigates what determines the contents and the nature of our internal subjective experiences and the biological processes that underpin them, so very much the same terrain. And like Anil, she brings together all sorts of different disciplines to investigate typical and altered states of consciousness, so psychedelics and meditation and different psychiatric and neurological conditions. Welcome, Olivia. Thank you. Anil, thanks for the fantastic and provocative presentation. So, I mean, if conscious experience is at best a guess of the world around us, a controlled hallucination as you're describing it, what if we get it wrong?
Well, I think we're always wrong, but we're just wrong in a useful way. And we're systematically wrong. Kant said hundreds of years ago that the world will always be hidden behind a sensory veil. So perception isn't a question of being right or wrong. I think it's a question of being useful or not useful. And of course, if our brain's predictive machinery goes off the rails, then it can be not simply wrong, but bad for us, not useful for us. We will start to misperceive the world in ways which both fail to recognize objective reality as it is, as independent from our minds. Because if I'm trying to cross the road and I don't see one of Melbourne's trams rattling towards me, then, of course, I'm going to be in trouble if I step out in front of it. So the real world exists. None of this is to say that the real world doesn't exist. But the way in which I experience that tram, the particular shape, color, noisiness of it, that's going to depend on the particularities of my brain. That's a collaboration between my brain and the world. So going wrong can mean when my brain's best guesses fail to guide my behavior in ways that are useful.
But you want to be getting your best guesses right more of the time than wrong most of the time.
And fortunately, evolution has sort of helped there, because we do tend to do that. So pretty much all the time, our perceptual best guesses are on track. I mean, they help us. Like sometimes there are some things which are quite difficult for us, right? We find it very hard to, for instance, perceive things happening over very slow timescales. But very slow timescales are very important as we're learning things like the climate emergency. But we find those very difficult to actually perceive. But things that happen at a human timescale and spatial scale, we tend to do quite well at most of the time. Of course, there are conditions, psychiatric conditions, neurological conditions, where this is no longer true. And in these cases, people's perceptual experiences become, as we said, not only wrong, but also problematically wrong.
So we have a whole lot of questions coming in, slido.com, and the key word is Seth, capital S, Seth 1810. I'm going to get to your questions in just a tick. Olivia Carter, you're interested in altered states of consciousness. Why? What do they help you probe? What do they help you interrogate about the experience of consciousness? So experiences of meditation where we're trying to sort of empty out our consciousness or refine our consciousness in some way, or psychedelics when we're just, letting it go a bit wild in there.
Yeah, so I've absolutely find it all fascinating in terms of trying to really push the boundaries, I guess, of human experience. So I think often it's talked about in the literature or in the popular media, and just as you've asked the question, to say, why are you interested in psychedelics and meditation, these very unusual states, and that the rest of the time everyone is having a very correct...
Boring, typical, normal...
Typical, normal. We talked about this, and I actually think what's really interesting about those states merges directly with the sorts of things that Anil's talking about and trying to measure with the perception census, and really thinking about that diversity of experiences as possible. It's funny, when you asked him the question about what if we're getting it all wrong? We know that everyone is having different experiences. So if someone is right, then the rest of us are wrong. So thinking about the possibility of the types of experiences that a human brain can support, I think, is really interesting.
Okay, so what is interrogating states of meditation and interrogating psychedelics revealing to you?
That they're very unusual states. But
so let's take psychedelics.
Yeah.
Psilocybin, magic mushies.
Yeah.
Because that isn't, this is her excuse anyway. This is why she's studying these things.
Yeah.
Have you ever taken them? Ah!
Well, I can say this, I've been asked this before, and people normally in the psychedelic space don't like to talk about these things, but there's a few scientists in the room, and if you're doing human experiments, I feel like you should always at least have a sense of what you're putting your participants through.
So what is, this is great, this is, but I didn't inhale. So what does psilocybin reveal to you about our conscious experience and how we can dement it?
Yeah, so the thing that I find particularly interesting about the psychedelics is that we do have a sense of the changes in the brain. We understand it's a chemical, we understand what part of the brain it activates. So it's not just a crazy sort of soup of activity, but then to try and actually systematically understand what are the things that happen in a kind of systematic way, I guess. Some people get a bit angry that I spend my time trying to almost reduce down these amazing experiences to what is systematically the same.
And so what do you reduce them down to?
Yeah, well, one sort, just as an example of...
Just give us an interesting finding.
Yeah, it's okay. So one sort of thing we do tonight... Okay, so I'll confess, I've already confessed. I did sit through this experiment myself, getting people, and as myself, but we ran some experiments in Switzerland during my PhD, and basically gave people magic mushrooms, sat them down in a laboratory, and presented a lot of stimuli, fairly boring sort of stimuli, little dots and, moving dots or static dots, and a really important... this is a fundamental question. People report taking psychedelic drugs. They say the world is brighter, things are brighter, colours are richer. No one had actually done any experiments to say, is the visual system more sensitive under these drugs? And so what becomes actually quite interesting is we showed really clearly it's not more sensitive. It's exactly as sensitive as it normally is. You're just as good at detecting little individual components in a scene. But what really changes is the way the brain integrates that information. So you end up, I guess, a different interpretation on the sensory data, but a very, very different sort of interpretation.
Not a higher state of consciousness as such. Anil Seth.
Yeah, that because one of the studies we did with psychedelics, ended up being caricatured in exactly that way. So we were interested in, again, these large-scale changes in the brain that accompany psilocybin, LSD, and ketamine as well, which in some doses is also a psychedelic, or like a psychedelic. And what we found, looking at data recorded while people were in these states, was that there was a particular measure, and it's a measure of like how random the brain's activity is. And this, in sleep and anesthesia, it goes down. This is very reliable. And we'd always looked for a case where it might go up compared to sort of waking normal baseline. And we hadn't found one until we looked at psychedelics. And there we found this increase in this measure. So the brain becomes more random when you're under psychedelics in this specific way, through this specific lens. But because this was sort of already a measure of like losing consciousness, like it goes down when you fall asleep. So when we wrote it up, it became rapidly misunderstood as like, oh, scientists have found evidence that psychedelics give you a higher state of consciousness, but we knew that all along. Why do we need these stupid scientists to tell us that? And it's like, no, that's wrong on many levels. That's just, it's not what we said and it's not what we did. But what was clear is that, for echoing Olivia's point, for a very specific and quite limited in a way pharmacological intervention in the brain, you get massive changes both in experience and in what happens to the brain's dynamics, and that's fascinating for consciousness research.
So let's weave in some of your questions because they're coming in thick and fast and I want to make sure I get to a stack of them. Dan has asked, and this is a great question from what we've been discussing, is consciousness a scale or a binary phenomenon? Dan asks, what is the internal experience, for example, of a crow or a dog or a gorilla? Is my dog just as conscious as I? I would like to think so. But they have their own distinct conscious experience, surely, one that I can never have.
There's a wonderful German word called Umwelt, which is supposed to characterize the sensory world of other animals. Like for a dog, it'd be much more olfactory than it would be for a human being. The philosopher Thomas Nagel had this famous paper, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? And with echolocation. Of course, we would never know what it's like to be a bat. Only a bat can know that. But we can conclude that these experiences would be very different, and perhaps not in a way that can be reduced to a single scale. It's something I've actually thought about quite a bit, in the sense there are some things in science that are like that. Temperature, a full understanding of temperature is something that has a single scale. Like, we're a single number, and that's fine. We can approximate consciousness like that a bit. And this is a useful thing to do, and people are under anesthesia and so on. It's useful to kind of collapse it down to a single number, but really it's more than one dimension. Even within humans, we can be more conscious in some ways and less conscious in others. We can be, for instance, more present in our perceptual worlds and less present in ourselves, or we can be ruminating, following our inner train of thought and less conscious of what's going on in the world around us. So one of my colleagues here, actually in Melbourne, Tim Bain, talked about consciousness as really this multi-dimensional thing, not a single level. And Olivia, I think you're part of that, weren't you?
It's not just one thing.
Yeah.
And Eva's asked a really great question here too about is consciousness based on, if consciousness is based on experience, are babies and children less conscious? Any thoughts on that, Olivia?
I have thoughts on this. I actually wrote some articles about this in The Conversation years ago as I had little babies. I've got 3. Now they're not babies anymore. But really thinking about, and it's a really interesting question not to ask whether or not, even if they are less conscious, but what would that even mean? So in one version of things, I think it's really important to think about in the ethical side of things. When you say less conscious, people have a general sense of what that means. But if that means less diversity of possible experiences, let's say that, I could imagine that a worm it experiences something to be a worm, but maybe it doesn't have the full richness of our experiences, and maybe a tiny infant would be similar. But if there is an evolutionary value in consciousness, I would imagine the most sort of elemental experience would probably be something of pain. Or aversive, positive, negative. So there's a version of things that I could imagine in a baby or a worm or something else that might have a limited repertoire of possible experiences, but that experience itself could be very intense. So even if it were true on some measure that it turns out that some animal or some infant has a less rich experience, it could follow, or it doesn't suggest that it's less intense or not powerful in some way or extremely meaningful.
Or you wonder whether there might be different sophistications of consciousness, Anil. I mean, for example, we think of a bird brain. We have this sort of term. We go bird brain. Oh, they're bird brained. They're dumb. And yet birds do something that none of us can do. They can fly. Unbelievable. That must be a very distinct conscious experience.
There's a real challenge for us here, which is to navigate between the tendency we all have to be very anthropocentric, to sort of put humans at the center of the universe in every way, while also recognizing there may be some distinctive things about human beings. I think historically we've lurched a bit too much towards the anthropocentric side of things. I mean, Descartes famously denied that non-human animals were conscious. Consciousness has historically been often associated with intelligence, with language, with the so-called higher cognitive functions. But I agree with Olivia that the more primal conscious experiences, the more conserved across species and across development, are likely to be emotional experiences such as pain, fear, disgust, pleasure. And so I've forgotten what the question was.
Well, like, for example, sophistications of consciousness. So a bird, right. the example of a bird.
Right, so in navigating this balance between anthropocentrism, this tendency to put ourselves at the center of things, and still recognizing there's something distinctive about human cognition and consciousness, it's a very hard thing to balance. Historically, we've not done a particularly good job of it. But there is still some truth to the fact that human beings, for instance, have a language, have a facility with language, which doesn't seem to be there in non-human animals. Even parrots, even dolphins, they may have proto-languages of sorts, but it does seem there's something quite special about human language. So we could defend the idea that human consciousness is more sophisticated in some of these ways. Having language allows us to have a wider range of conscious experiences than we would without language. But there would be other kinds of sophistication, maybe sensory sophistication, the ability to experience the world in a directly perceptual way, where other creatures may well outstrip human beings.
How much of an influence, asks someone, do you think the subconscious mind has on our waking lives? Olivia?
I've thought less about this. Do you have a strong opinion about that?
Well, I think that there's many...
To some extent, all consciousness is subconscious.
I think there's all consciousness is subconscious.
That's getting...
I'm not sure. That's not the way I would put it, but it's an interesting perspective.
Play with me. We're experimenting here.
People often mean different things by unconscious, right? For some people, it's really associated with Freud and the subconscious, this kind of repressed mind that sometimes explodes into the surface of our awareness and our behavior. There's a much more, perhaps less flowery sense of the unconscious, which simply points to the fact that not everything that our brains do affects our experience. So a whole history of experimentation in psychology has demonstrated that we can visually respond to the world in some simple ways without being conscious of what's happening at these times. You flash an image very, very quickly, surrounded by other images, you won't consciously experience that image, yet it can still affect behavior. So there is an interesting distinction between what we do unconsciously and what requires consciousness. And this gives us a clue actually to what consciousness is for. And it turns out that conscious perception is useful, seems to be useful, because it allows the brain to bring together many different sources of information, whether it's sensory information, memories, intentions, and integrate them in a way that can guide our behavior very flexibly. We're relatively automatic when we respond unconsciously to things.
Olivia?
Yeah, because you raised a good point, and actually looping back to the psychedelics and thinking about this point that Anil made really well in the talk as well about what is consciousness for. And I really agree that consciousness in terms of purpose is helping you to act meaningfully in the world. But it's interesting, this idea that there's clearly unconscious activity in the brain that's processing the sensory world and driving behaviour. And this separation between what is the element that it feels like. You know, when you think about, when you're asking sorts of questions around more, less conscious, these sorts of things around the sensory experiences versus the functional behavioural aspect, that's actually something I find really interesting in the psychedelic state. And I'll assume that nobody here in this audience has ever taken a psychedelic before. But if you can imagine everyone imagines the psychedelic art, imagines that experience and the intensity of sensation. Would anybody want a babysitter to be taking psychedelics? Not one person. Does anyone here think that you should take some psychedelics and then drive a car? Walk across the street. You gave the example, it doesn't really matter what colour the truck is. You need to get out of the way. So I think that's actually one thing. When we went back and interrogated what are the experiences like that match to the psychedelic state, on the one hand, people say everything's intensified. You know, consciousness there's more of it. It's broader. Functionally, I would say it goes the opposite way.
Not terribly useful.
It's not very useful. It might
have great therapeutic possibilities, and that's a whole other conversation. I know someone wants to ask about that, but too big for our topic today, and the great research going on in Australia about the therapeutics of psychedelics. But another question, which I think is important for us to get to, when, if ever, will AI achieve consciousness? Now, there's a sort of belief that if you build an intelligent enough AI, that somehow consciousness will emerge from that silicon intelligence. You think that the possibility of a conscious AI, Anil Seth, is a very, very bad idea?
I think it's a terrible idea to try to make conscious machines.
Why?
Because we would have an ethical responsibility to them, first and foremost. I firstly don't think it's anyway close. I don't think it's around the corner. But I also think it's not inconceivable that it's possible.
What would it take?
Well, that depends on which theory of consciousness you believe, right? And I think there's a certain amount of humility is needed here, because I have my own ideas which suggest that consciousness is fundamentally linked to our nature's living systems, and so you would need living machines in order to have conscious machines. But I'm probably wrong. I think all theories of consciousness are wrong. But they may be more or less wrong. Other theories of consciousness don't make that condition at all. And according to other theories of consciousness is something a computer could have if you program it the right way. And these theories, who knows? I think they're wrong, but they might be right. They might be on the right track. So I think we need to be very careful not pretending that we really are sure what's going on here, because the stakes are too high. If it is possible to build a conscious machine, basically you've introduced into the universe vast new potential for suffering of a kind that you might not even recognize. And that would be an ethical catastrophe. Just click on a mouse, and in the sort of activity of server farms across the world, you just create conscious experiences that you might not even know that you've done, and that may be negative, or may be negative in a way that we can't even recognize. So alien to us, even more so than a rat or a bat or a fish. So I think it's a really terrible idea for that reason. But that's very uncertain and far away, I think.
But there are concerns about the fact that even if we don't invent a conscious AI, we might imagine our artificial intelligence creations to be conscious, and that has all sorts of implications, doesn't it?
So this is the danger that I've been most focused on, because I think whatever you believe about what it would really take for something to be conscious, I think we're nearly at a point already where we interact with systems that give us the almost incorrigible impression that we're dealing with another conscious mind. Already a couple of years ago, there was this engineer for Google who got sacked because he claimed that this language model was conscious, that Lambda was conscious. And that was then, and now we interact with ChatGPT, and it's getting better all the time. And it's exploiting our anthropomorphic tendencies now to project qualities into things on the basis of things that we think are related to consciousness. So again, we tend to think language is really indicative of consciousness. So to the extent something appears to talk back to us in a human-like way, we'll project consciousness into it, even though it's not there, and even though we might know it's not there.
With what consequences and concerns do you think?
I think that this is going to be very disruptive for society. We risk being open to coercion by these systems if we believe we're interacting with a conscious system or a system that has a mind. It can exploit our cognitive frailties and vulnerabilities more readily. There's also, for me, an ethical and moral thing here, which is that if we perceive something as being conscious, well, there's two ways we can respond to it. Either we treat it as if it actually is. We'll start caring about it in the way people would look after these little Tamagotchi video game things. But we would do this in a much more visceral way.
Or we don't treat it
well. And if we do treat them well, then we're caring about things which is going to probably mean we care less about other things that we really should care about, non-human animals, for instance. The alternative, of course, is that we learn to treat them badly.
Which undermines our own humanity.
Which is a brutalism to our own psychology. And yes, it exactly undermines, distorts our own humanity. So I don't think there's an easy solution to this. And it's perhaps a question of designing AI so that it's not an attempt to mimic or replace us, but a transparent technology that complements our cognitive weaknesses and does not pull on our anthropomorphic strings.
Really interesting. So much to talk about there. Lots of questions coming in about meditation. And meditation, Olivia, is as considerable interest to your research. And Dan asks, yogic wisdom builds a theory of mind on the 5 koshas, or layers of the body. To what extent, if at all, has this Eastern wisdom influenced your research? Hold that thought. Might not have at all. I don't know. But there are quite a few here, and I'm just going to try and find them here. It's hard following this. Where are they all? Where are all the meditation questions now that I can't see? I can't see it. No, but there were others. Yell them out if you asked one and I can't see it here. There were others. Oh, sometimes I hate technology, and mostly I love it. Could you please speak a bit about meditation as a tool to observe consciousness?
Sure. I'm extremely interested in meditation and as we've talked about before in terms of understanding the breadth of human experience. But I have to confess, I'm not an expert meditator.
No.
And but what I was going to say is
what are you investigating about meditation?
So I just was going to also give a shout out to Toby Woods, who's done a lot of the real work in my group, leading that space. But what he's done and the work that I'm extremely interested in is really systematically trying to map out the nature of the experiences that are induced by different forms of meditation. I think one question that he was asking and was really peering into is this question of contentless states. So what would that even mean? Are they truly contentless? And on the one hand, without going into huge amounts of details, even just is it possible to have a truly contentless state if on the other hand we're saying that consciousness is the purpose of consciousness is to have a sort of rich understanding and pulling in this sensory data and acting on that sensory data.
Because we're not desensitising ourselves when we meditate.
No, so just trying to sort of systematically, I mean, I was having, in one of the undergraduate lectures just the other day, I was presenting some of this work and the students came up to me at the end and they were visibly angry that I was devaluing the nature of the experience in that we're trying to systematically sort of look at what are the bits, and we hadn't, captured all of the bits on the different graphs and saying part of my point was one dimension is not enough.
So what are you revealing about meditation so far, you and your colleagues, Toby and your colleagues? I mean, Robin's asked here, so with meditation practice, is there a possibility that we change or we expand the predictive ability of the brain-mind?
So framing it in the predictive coding sense, I'll leave to Anil. Do you have thoughts about meditation and?
I think it depends on what kind of meditation is going on. So in a typical kind of meditation is really, it's almost a training of attention. So you're training yourself to pay attention to the sensations as they come and go and not get sort of dragged along with them or with all the internal train of thought. So in terms of this idea of the brain as a prediction machine, what you might be doing is sort of changing the balance between how quickly the brain is leaping to a best guess about something and letting the sensory information, whether it's from the world or the body, dominate a little bit. But I think there are many stories you could tell about exactly how they relate. But I agree with you. I mean, it's a fascinating manipulation. And in terms of this idea that adding a scientific dimension to something devalues it. Which is something that comes across quite often in the study of consciousness, whether it's meditation or not.
Keep the mystery
Keep the mystery. I think it's unfortunate because I think the scientific dimension really does add to it, and it doesn't detract from the value, the wonder, and the meaning. It enhances. And I think trying to cut through to that, I think, is always a challenge. But it's a challenge that I think we, as consciousness researchers, need to meet, because we need to not just show, this is a brain and it does this, but we need to explain the relevance and the value of a neuroscience of consciousness for people's everyday lives.
I think the other thing I would add to that, and what I defended to my angry students, was that as sort of researchers in the field, I'm sure Anil is the same, we don't think we have the answers. This is...
Oh, I do. No, I don't.
So, a lot of the work that I've been doing has been motivated by this sort of older view that consciousness can be sort of fully explained as a single thing that cannot go up and down. To me, that seems a bit limited. There's something missing there. And then trying to pull apart, okay, can we explain it in 2 or 3 dimensions? The more we sort of try and unpack the richness in what different ways, what are the different parameters that conscious experience can change, then that will increase our understanding. It's like, what is this thing that we're actually trying to study? And so I think it's extremely valuable to go from we've got 1 dimension, that's probably not enough. Is it 3? Is it 5? Starting to pick apart.
So you could pin it down somehow.
And I feel like we're easily in the space of multiple different things we can think about. Okay, these are really fundamentally different sorts of directions that consciousness can move. If we got to a point where we found 15, okay, that would be better than 1. But it doesn't mean that if we're failing to capture the full richness of the meditation space or the psychedelic space, that, we were wrong and whoever's having these experiences are right. It's more trying to increase that nuanced understanding.
Yes.
And increase the richness of understanding.
So we have to wrap now. It's just barely long enough. We need 2 hours. So I'm going to just ask one final question for you, though. I mean, the mystery of consciousness is just a delicious problem to interrogate as a scientist, as a philosopher, as a neuroscientist, as a psychologist. But let's think about the pragmatics. What tangible benefits can this have in our everyday lives, Anil, as you were probing earlier?
There are many, and some of the most immediate tangible benefits are in medicine. So understanding what happens after brain injury when people's consciousness is disturbed in various ways, trying to find ways to remediate that. Psychiatric disorders in particular. We're experiencing epidemics of mental illnesses of various kinds, depression, anxiety, also schizophrenia. And medically, frankly, we're still a little bit in the dark ages with these things. Like, we have treatments that can address the symptoms, but very rarely get at the causes. It's as if we're taking paracetamol rather than antibiotic for things like psychiatric problems. So a consciousness science can begin to shed light on really what's going on. Why do people have the distressing experiences they have in these conditions? And I think there's a lot of promise there. Then there's other applications in technology. How we interact with things like virtual reality is hugely dependent on an understanding of how perception works. We've talked about artificial intelligence. We want to design systems that complement us and not replace us. And then finally, there's implications in things like the law. You know, we hold people responsible in many legal traditions on the basis of some philosophically extremely naive concept of free will. You know, did somebody do it or not? Did they do it of their own free will? And the discussion of when to hold people responsible for their actions and when not to is something that is already evolving in light of a better understanding of the neuroscience of free will. And then finally, we have things like ethical implications for animal welfare and even for end of life and choice of life decisions. Consciousness research, I think, really permeates pretty much every aspect of society, and it's already making a difference.
Yes, absolutely. And final comment to you, Olivia.
So I would, well, do you want me to just add to that? He covered a full.
He did.
Swathes of things. Do you want me to? I'm happy.
But you've been interested in, as a consciousness researcher, you have been in, and we'll keep it brief.
Yeah.
You've been very interested in thinking about the practical uses.
Very much
you have worked inside psychiatric hospitals, for example.
Yeah. So the thing that I would really emphasise that I think is very important, because a lot of the work that I do is really mapping out the nature of the subjective experience. And for the person, for every person, it's the subjective experience that is their reality. That's it. That's their universe. And so where I think, first of all, for me, it's interesting just to understand the diversity of experience, but particularly in the case when you've got another being, human or non-human, that can't communicate very well. I think the field has spent a lot of time trying to find indexes of consciousness. Okay, but if we can make that more nuanced and look for indexes of pain or pleasure or cognitive, paying attention to things, having sense of purpose or meaning, or the things that we value, I think we need to have a full understanding of the map of sort of possible experiences or components of experience, and then think, are some of these more ethically important? So if we can start having indexes, so if there's a patient
really interesting.
that can't communicate, or an animal, or a child, an infant that can't communicate properly, we're making judgments, often end of life care or ethical sort of decisions
based on a very partial understanding.
Based on a very partial understanding
of their
It'd be
interior
nice
life.
To know, they might have a very rich sensory experience, but no ability to think, no cognition, no memory or anything.
Yeah,
that would not be a positive state. So just better understanding that space.
And what do you hope to, Anil, find from your perception survey, your perception census?
So the perception census, it's really kind of an exploratory adventure for me. It's unlike the normal kind of way we do experiments. We've got a very clear idea of what we're looking for. I was excited by this project partly because of its open-ended and exploratory nature.
It might be really wild what you find. I mean, it might be that we're all having this quite distinct interior existence that's quite different from the people around us.
Well, there's one thing about most studies in psychology are done on undergraduate psychology students, which, as interesting and as wonderful as they are, probably don't represent the full diversity of human life.
Who's an undergraduate psychology student? Yes. Wholly representative of the universal experience.
Extremely important segment of society, but not the whole thing. So I'm very interested to see quite what this diversity is, and is it different in different countries? What aspects of perception go together with which others? Do we have things like perceptual personalities, where different ways of perceiving an experience cluster together? I think things like this will be hugely interesting, and the applications here again, I think, are also quite profound, because just as we live in social media echo chambers, we also inhabit perceptual echo chambers, but we don't generally even know that we do, because it seems to us that we see things as they are.
So you think this could have profound social implications?
I think a broader recognition of perceptual differences can help both, for instance, empathize better with neurodivergent conditions, because we are all neurodiverse, but in general increase the amount of humility we have for our own ways of perceiving, and therefore the beliefs that we might have and the thoughts that we might have too. And cultivating, I think, a bit of humility about our own lived experience and the beliefs that we base on that is a little bit necessary in the world in which we're living today.
particularly right now, and that is the very point I wanted to land on. Anil Seth, Olivia Carter, thank you so much. And Anil is going to be doing a book signing now out the front there. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to send you, the museum will send you a survey for some feedback. We'd love you to respond to that because it helps them build fabulous events as part of this Future Forum series and into 2024. And if you do it, so if you just purely want to do it for selfish reasons, you go in there running for a $50 voucher at the museum shop. Excellent timing for Christmas, don't you think? Coming up at the Melbourne Museum, the Sunrise Collection, Turtle Robots, Lego, Lego, I don't know, in the classroom, about retro tech, yes, pushing the boundaries of the education system in the 80s. That's on the Wednesday, the 25th of October. So that sounds fantastic. Megalodon and the Age of Ocean Giants. Hey, I'm going to be in conversation at that with the great Tim Flannery. Come along to that on Tuesday the 28th of November. He is always absolutely fantastic. Let's go sign some books. Thank you so much for being here. Let's give them a big thanks.
Thank you.